Despite the warning, 1,300 passengers arrived at New York's Pier 54 to board the giant Cunarder. There were only 12 cancellations. Rumors persisted that the ship was armed and carrying war supplies. The British denied it. So did the New York port collector, who cleared the ship for sailing. On board were 159 Americans. As citizens of a neutral country, it was felt that their presence alone would be the absolute guarantee of safety against any proposed U-boat attack.
You had that ironic situation, and it looks so naive now, when we think that any shipping company could, in 1914, have continued to keep a vessel in service across the hostile North Atlantic, when it was a German proclivity to sink anything in sight.
5 days later, off the southern coast of Ireland, Lusitania received a radio message warning of submarine activity in the area. U-boat skipper Lieutenant Walter Schweiger had found good hunting in the fishing grounds off the Irish coast. In 48 hours, he'd sunk 2 Harrison Line steamers. At 2 p.m. on the 15th of May, Schweiger spotted an enormous steamer with 4 funnels and 2 masts. He gave the order to dive and give chase. At 3 p.m., the unidentified liner changed course to take a bearing off the old head of Kinsale. In doing so, it offered Schweiger a perfect target. In less than 20 minutes, Lusitania sank 300 feet down to the sandy bottom. The news reached London shortly after 4 p.m., an hour after the attack. Cunard and the London newspapers said details were still coming in, but it appeared that all the passengers had been saved. The next morning, a more accurate picture emerged. Of the 1,918 on board, 1,195 perished. The Irish port of Queenstown had known tragedy before. 3 years earlier, it had been the last port of call for Titanic on her fateful maiden voyage across the Atlantic. Now, townspeople rallied to help Lusitania survivors and deal with the scores of bodies that had washed ashore. 123 Americans had perished in the disaster, including millionaire sporting identity Alfred Vanderbilt and famous theatrical producer Charles Frohman. The disaster stunned America. President Woodrow Wilson wept when told of the sinking. On Wall Street, hundreds of millions of dollars were lost in the market, and Washington was abuzz with talk of America joining the war.
Castles of the Sea is sponsored in part by Tylenol, the pain reliever hospitals use most, and by Lexus. The future of Lexus is here. Fasten your seatbelts.
In Germany, the sinking was applauded. News of the speed at which Lusitania sank and survivors' accounts of a second explosion following the torpedo were used to justify Germany's claim that Lusitania was carrying munitions destined for Britain.
I don't think there's any doubt that she was carrying a certain limited amount of ammunition, but nothing that would have caused the huge explosion that did occur.
In 1993, after nearly 80 years of controversy, Dr. Robert Ballard, discoverer of the Titanic, led an expedition to the wreck of the Lusitania in an attempt to discover the reason for the second explosion. Was Lusitania carrying explosives as Germany claimed? Or was there another explanation? Rather than contraband, Ballard found evidence to suggest that the torpedo hit a nearly empty fuel bunker, igniting highly combustible coal dust.
So I think Ballard has got it about right, and that it was a secondary explosion of a mixture of coal dust which blew the side out of the ship, and that's why she went down so quickly.
Both sides used the incident for propaganda, at home and abroad. A medal struck in Germany, celebrating the sinking of the so-called blockade runner, created furor in Britain. Meanwhile, movie cameras captured Lusitania's final moments on a duck pond on London's Wimbledon Common. Presented in newsreel cinemas as actual footage of the disaster, the film was designed to fuel international hatred of Germany. Winston Churchill seemed to be looking for just such an incident. In top-secret correspondence written months earlier, Churchill stressed the importance of attracting neutral shipping to British shores in hopes of drawing the US into the war with Germany. He stressed Britain's need for the ocean trade. The more, the better, he said. But if some of it gets into trouble, better still. Churchill's macabre wish came true, but at the cost of nearly 1,200 innocent lives. For its part, Germany had unwittingly fallen into Churchill's trap and offered the world its first terrible vision of absolute war.
And that, in a sense, set the tone for the world that after 100 years almost of the Congress of Vienna to the sinking of the Lusitania, that civilians were not safe. There was no respect for civilian traffic as opposed to naval or war traffic.
The sinking of Lusitania dramatically changed United States opinions toward Germany, but isolationist sentiment won out. President Wilson refrained from declaring war. Instead, he sent a damning protest to the Kaiser, warning that the US would not tolerate further incidents. American passenger ships would now sail the Atlantic with guns mounted to fend off any overzealous U-boat captain. But the attacks continued. And every American ship that limped into port holed by torpedoes or wrecked by gunfire further pressured the president. Finally, on April 6, 1917, after 2 years of provocation, the United States Congress voted to declare war on Germany. Across America, young men rallied to the call to arms. The American Expeditionary Force would offer a fresh vitality to the exhausted Allied battalions bogged down in the mud and misery of Europe. But how to get them there? The answer? Dozens of German passenger liners tied up in US ports. All German liners were immediately interned at the declaration of war. Now, they were to be transformed from passenger ships to American troop ships. In some cases, German crews scuttled or sabotaged their ships rather than give their new enemy an advantage. To clear a path for transports on the Atlantic, US and British submarine chasers and blimps made an all-out assault on the elusive German U-boats.
eastern seaboard of America, bound for France, were shiploads of troops fresh to war and high in morale. Men full of confidence and the "we'll soon finish this off" kind of spirit.
When crowds at a French port cheered the arrival of General Pershing, the American commander-in-chief, the Germans could no longer boast that no American soldier would ever set foot on the soil of Europe. For now the first was setting foot, and so were thousands more of his fellow countrymen.
Over the coming months, nearly 2 million soldiers would cross the perilous Atlantic on converted liners. It was the largest seaborne transportation of troops in history, and certainly the most dangerous. By the summer of 1918, American soldiers had joined a massive counter-offensive that would bring an end to the war.
In the Argonne, the Stars and Stripes rose from the ground, and the promise behind all that training and build-up of American strength was fulfilled. So then it was British, French, American, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, and South African together sweeping the grey from the field.
Finally, on November 11th, 1918, the battlefields of Europe fell silent for the first time in 4 years. At war's end, hundreds of overcrowded troopers and hospital ships journeyed home. The Atlantic crossing of a week or two was bearable. But for Australian and New Zealand troops, the 2-month voyage left many wondering if they'd ever reach home at all. Homecomings in New York drew enormous crowds. The ex-German liner Vaterland, renamed Leviathan, had transported over 110,000 troops to Europe. On one extraordinary crossing, she carried more than 14,000 people. At that time, the greatest number of passengers to travel on one ship ever recorded. The liners made a tremendous impact in the war to end all wars. Their capacity to move entire armies from continent to continent was instrumental in globalizing the war and shifting the balance of power to the Allies. In 1919, the victors met in Paris to decide on the fate of Germany. With 13 million tons of Allied merchant shipping lost, now was the time to settle the score. The 3 giants of the Hamburg-America line were awarded to their American and British competitors. Cunard received Imperator and renamed her Berengaria. Leviathan went into service for the United States line, and the world's largest liner, Bismarck, was taken over by the White Star Line and renamed Majestic. Albert Ballin, the director of the Hamburg-America line, as if foreseeing the inevitable loss of his great fleet, took an overdose of sleeping pills 2 days before the armistice. Devastation of war. Old wounds resurfaced. A tidal wave of refugees, many facing political and religious persecution, went in search of a new life in other lands. Hopeful immigrants took one-way passage on steamers bound for Canada, South America, Australia, and New Zealand. But for the overwhelming majority, the destination was America.
We left from Hamburg. Ship's name was Reliance.
The name of the ship was the SS Saarland.
And I think it was called the Cameronia.
In the early post-war years, as many as 30,000 immigrants crossed the Atlantic by liner each week.
I remember hordes of people. There were more people on that boat than I thought.
There was 6 of us. I'm sorry, 7. 6 children and my mother. We're all in one room.
We lived in the lowest part of the ship and the whole way down the hold on a 3-tier, as I remember, 3-tier high beds. In the first 2-3 days, whoever was in the bottom was out of luck.
My mother and my sister and I were seasick all the 3 weeks we were on that boat.
The food was excellent. It was good food.
The food was horrible. As I know, my mother was a terrific cook. But as far as I was concerned, it was a part of like adventure, especially when during the day when you went up the steps and went out on the deck and looked out and saw that big expanse of ocean. It was impressive.
Tremendous. Of course, everybody got excited when we could see the skyline. All the people rushed up on deck, but we felt that the ship was going to roll over because all the passengers were on one side of the ship. But it was just fabulous. We were all waiting for the moment to see the Statue of Liberty because that was a sign we are now here.
Immigrants traveling in first and second class were processed by officials on board and disembarked at the shipping line's terminal. But for passengers in steerage, the journey was far from over. They were ferried to Ellis Island in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. With its grandiose architecture, Ellis Island represented a gateway of both hope and fear for the immigrants. Here they would face hours, sometimes even days, of rigorous processing and questioning.
There was one large room. We were all in one large room. And I remember, first of all, they took all our clothing and washed it and cleaned it. And we had a chance to shower and clean ourselves. And we had the physical examinations.
For all new arrivals, there is a medical examination to weed out those with serious illnesses and dangerous diseases.
The real concern was, my mother said, if you go, when you come to we're coming to the medical department, when you get to the medical department, don't cough or anything like that.
And being examined, especially my hair, they were very careful about not letting people in with lice.
Many immigrants were detained at the island's hospital for weeks and months at a time, the cost of which was borne by the shipping lines. Anyone ruled physically or mentally unfit would be sent back to the line for deportation.
I was pulled out on a physical, and we had to stay an extra night, overnight. I had to be re-examined, and I was just fearful that I would be sent back. To this day, I always feel that if it was up to that, I would have gone back. My family would have stayed here, and that was my fear. I was 11 years old.
People turned away and were walking away crying bitter tears, but it obviously didn't help them because they walked away with an officer with them. And we were allowed to go through this door, and they had to go through that door.
Today, more than 1 in 3 Americans can trace their ancestry to that first, often fearful step onto American soil at Ellis Island and that unforgettable passage by ocean liner.
In earlier years, up until the early 20s, 18 million people came across the Atlantic, all of them by sea. And most of them stopping at Ellis Island as part of the great process. It was the greatest movement the world has ever seen of people from one continent to another, from the old world to the new.
You know, the creation of the American dream. And without the big superliners, there wouldn't have been any American dream.
I don't think I'll ever forget it, because that was one of the most important aspects of my life. Being aboard ship and knowing my destination. But you look forward to being Americans.
Among the lucky people, I was one of the luckiest. Freedom. Opportunity, freedom, which encompasses every possible definition of that word.
I reflect upon it all the time, because to us, it was a matter of life or death. Because all my mother's family, and there must have been over 100 people in that small town, they all perished. And we lived because of that journey.